Hello, we're here once again. That's right. Look, apologies for the birds. No problems with the wind today. Now, I'd like to look at the concept of power, because as you know, if power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And over the last few months, Australians have begun to understand that they don't have the rights and liberties they believed they were born with, which they were enshrined in the Constitution. Because of all the Western countries, of all the liberal democracies, the parliamentary democracies around the world, Australia is one sovereign nation state that really has no constitutional protections for the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power. Now, when legislation was introduced 20 years ago, around 20 years ago after 9/11, nobody really was interested. A small group I was involved with the Wednesday Action Group, we hijacked a few politicians' offices to highlight our concerns, did some sit-ins, which came to naught. And since then, over 85 pieces of legislation have been introduced into Parliament, which have removed common law rights and liberties. Most Australians didn't blink. They felt, well, this is what is necessary in order to combat terrorism. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen the rapid removal of freedoms which people took for granted. And I think people are beginning to realise, Australians are beginning to realise, there are no protections. So what is power? What is the nation state? Because we all live in sovereign nation states around the world. We don't live in tribal societies. We live in sovereign nation states. There's over 206 sovereign nation states on planet Earth. Each has its own arrangements. They range from totalitarian states to feudal monarchies to parliamentary democracies and everything in between. A sovereign nation state normally has a monopoly on the use of force within the region it controls. That gives it the ability to enact the laws and enforce those laws through a range of coercive arms, through police, through paramilitary organisations, through armed forces, through secret services. So, as we can see, the sovereign nation state with a monopoly on the use of force, if there are no checks and balances on that use of force against its own citizens, then we see the atrocities we see around the world, and atrocities we've seen for thousands of years during the history of planet Earth and the history of the various groups that have colonised different parts of this world and imposed sovereign nation states and decentralised tribal societies. So what's that got to do with us today? What is power? Well, power is based on two important concepts: inequalities in power and inequalities in wealth. It's inequalities in power and wealth which give people the opportunity to impose their will on others. And what we've seen in the last 40 years in this country is a concentration of wealth and the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication in the hands of fewer and fewer people during the corporatisation, globalisation era. So we have seen inequalities in wealth which give corporations the ability to dictate the parliamentary agenda in Australia. So inequalities in wealth is fundamental to rulers. No, I haven't been shot, it's all right, yet. Just a backfire from a little who knows what. So it's inequalities in wealth which give corporations in a capitalist society, one based on private profit, private investment for private profit, power. So we've seen an increasing power as far as wealth is concerned, concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. At the same time, what we have seen is a concentration of power in the hands of the state. And the scenes you've seen in Victoria of the police overreacting, some exceptionally, once again we have that noise, some exceptionally minor disruption by people who are opposed to the COVID-19 restrictions, highlights how much power can be concentrated in the state. So power is based on wealth, and it's based on decision-making capacity. And as you concentrate fewer and fewer, as you concentrate more and more, my apologies, as you concentrate more and more power in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals and groups, we see the maximum that absolute power corrupts absolutely become a reality. Irrespective of what you think of the United States of America and Mr. Trump, their current president, there are enough checks and balances in the United States constitutional framework to give some arbitrary protection to the individual, in terms of the state not having a monopoly on the use of force, and in terms of people having inalienable rights. When you look at the way Australia is structured, although we like to think of ourselves as a liberal democracy which respects the rule of law, the problem is the individual and minorities have no protection from the arbitrary exercise of state power. So whatever is passed in both houses of Parliament, at a federal and state level, and a single House of Parliament in Queensland at a state level, becomes law. And when you have a fourth estate, which is basically the media, both privately owned and corporately owned and government owned, acting as a cheer squad for legislation which strips people of basic human rights, then you have the situation which we see in Australia today, which unfolds as we see the state take the iron fist out of the velvet glove. And that's what we are currently seeing in this country. We are seeing that our constitutional framework provides no protection for the individual, has more and more and more power, is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. If you look at human history, some of the greatest atrocities that have occurred is when state power is transferred via a variety of mechanisms, whether it's violence, whether it's an election, or in the case of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, a combination of both. What we see is that when that power is concentrated in so few hands, we see the state mobilised to carry out some of the greatest atrocities during human history. So it's that concentration of power in the state and in the power and in the hands of individuals which makes it possible for industrial carnage, industrial scale carnage, ethnic cleansing, the destruction of opposition within nation states, and the most brutal practices possible, as we saw during the Chilean coup, when the Argentinian and also the Chilean government was summarily executing dissidents, and as we see in Israel and Palestine today, with the summary execution of people who resist the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So the list goes on and on. So inequalities in power and wealth is at the very heart of the problems we face as a community today. Now, public interest before corporate interest, which I'm the registered officer of, public interest before corporate interest is based on the concept, two very important concepts. One, sharing wealth, creating wealth in a sustainable way and sharing that wealth through the introduction of a universal basic income which ensures that every person living in our society has the capacity to survive economically irrespective of the pressures placed on them, whether it's individual pressures, pressures from a natural disaster, pressures from repression, coercion, individual coercion, and the list goes on and on. So universal basic income is a very important way of ensuring that inequality in wealth which is growing is reversed. The second thing that we are interested in is the devolution of power. It's a fancy word for the sharing of power. By introducing a constitutional framework which protects the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power, and also introducing systems of government which are decentralised and which do not put power in the hands of a small clique or individuals. So the struggle to create a community based on the sharing of power and wealth is at the very heart of the political, social and cultural calendar of public interest before corporate interests. Now, a lot of people talk about human nature and how it's inevitable that we will continue to kill each other and exploit each other. Well, in some degree, I support that concept, which may seem strange to many people watching this video. Now, each and every one of us has a capacity to be involved in the most inhumane acts. To a significant degree, those acts are related to the type of society we find ourselves in. So as I said before, it's ordinary people that are involved in some of the most brutalised massacres and extinctions and ethnic cleansing in human history. It's the ordinary individual who is placed in a difficult situation, who makes the decision they want to live, and if that means killing other people, that means killing other people. And when you look at military training, there's huge vestiges of that in all military training, where the individual is retrained, rebuilt up to be able to perform that murder. And it's involved because human beings are not ordinarily murderers. Human beings may murder because of passion, because of anger, but it's unusual for human beings to murder for the sake of murder, and it's unlikely that human beings will be involved in acts of mass slaughter if we didn't live in societies which promoted that slaughter. And that's what we see on a regular basis. The more centralised power is, the greater the damage which can be caused. And the important thing to realise is that anybody who finds themselves in that position of power, especially if that power is absolute, can then use state power to impose their will not only on their own citizens but the people outside their national boundaries. And that's what we see in war over and over and over again. So the struggle to contain power, the struggle to share power, is fundamental to the struggle to create a fairer society. Fundamental. Because the basic problem is hierarchy. The fact that an individual captures state power or is elected to state power and then can use that state power, that monopoly on the use of force by the police, paramilitary groups, the armed services, in order to impose their will, not only on their citizens, but people around the globe. And this is what we see over and over again. So the struggle against hierarchy, the struggle against the concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands, the struggle to share wealth and prevent the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands is fundamental to the struggle to create a fairer society. Because if power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if we are not involved in that struggle to share power, share wealth, and ensure that the citizen, the individual, has constitutional protections against the arbitrary exercise of state power, and if we don't create societies which have checks and balances to prevent individuals and small groups from seizing state power and using the monopoly on force which the state enjoys to impose their will on its citizens and the people outside their national boundaries, then we will continue to repeat the mistakes of the past, and we will continue to see the massacres, the ethnic cleansing, the genocides which have been part and parcel of human history, while power is concentrated in fewer hands and wealth is concentrated in fewer hands. And as the 21st century evolves, as we are seeing the same worrying trend of power being concentrated in the hands of individuals who then use the monopoly on force that sovereign nation states enjoy in order to impose their will on their citizens and the people around their nation state. And in the 21st century we've seen the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and that makes it imperative that we become involved in that struggle. So as I say every week, you can join public interest before corporate interest, you can get involved in something else. The important thing to remember is, if you're not involved, nothing will ever change. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Absolute power is based on inequalities in power and wealth. It is based on the centralisation of power in the sovereign nation state and the concentration of economic wealth in unaccountable corporations whose major responsibility is to their major shareholders, not the nation state, not the community or anybody else.